Welcome to the Operations Science Podcast, where the art and science of operational excellence come to life through captivating stories of triumph, challenge, and transformation from the front lines of industry. Our distinguished guests, from manufacturing pioneers and medical device innovators to aerospace visionaries, diagnostic lab leaders, and major capital project leaders, unveil the hidden patterns and powerful insights that drive exceptional results in the complex world of operations. Join us on this journey of discovery as we explore the brilliant minds behind the systems that make our world work and uncover the leadership secrets that could revolutionize your approach to operations forever. This podcast is brought to you by the Operations Science Institute, the home of the science behind every operation. If you want to be a better operations or project leader, discover the principles of operations science for yourself. For a quick tour, visit the OSI Insider portal. The web address is insider.opscience.org, and be sure to check out the new book, Operations Science Applied, available on Amazon. Here is your host, Ed Pound.
Welcome to the Operations Science Podcast. Our guest today brings a strong blend of operational experience and spans advanced technology, systems engineering, and real-world mission execution. He has helped coordinate complex military aviation operations and currently helps plan long-term manufacturing growth in the microelectronics industry. In environments where the stakes are high and the systems are complex, leaders must constantly balance capacity, reliability, and speed while navigating uncertainty and rapid change. Today, we'll explore what it takes to plan and operate complex systems, how operational constraints shape real-world decision-making, and what lessons from military and semiconductor operations teach us about running modern production systems. Please welcome to the Operations Science Podcast, Josh Tree Dittmar. Hey, Tree, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Appreciate it, Ed.
Well, I'm glad you're here. It should be an interesting conversation. So to get started, could you describe your current role and how your work fits into the broader operations of a semiconductor manufacturer?
Yeah, sure. So my current role is really as a business operations manager. So that role entails planning for facilities, long-term growth. So kind of working in between the uh, strategy and growth group, and then also trying to support the capitalization of different assets. So the tools we buy are pretty expensive. So being able to plan for that and stay ahead of our customer and our customer base for what they need.
Okay, so that's yes, I've done a fair amount of work in semiconductor, and capacity planning is a huge issue because of the long lead time to get that equipment. I mean, typically we see something like 2 years. Is that what you're seeing in terms of acquisition of equipment?
Several years is kind of on par with what is expected. The other challenge is just the cost of the equipment. Some of these tools are many millions of dollars, and the ability to actually get that tool in-house, we're subject to the same kind of problems that the automobile industry is, but at a higher level of, I guess there are less tools that are going into that industry. So that's one of the challenges for sure.
Well, it's highly complex.
Highly complex, yes.
I mean, you're working at atomic levels when laying down different mass layers. Along those lines, I mean, even just getting the tool is one thing, but the other thing is once you get it, then getting up to speed and running in the factory. How long does that take?
It's a process as well. It depends on the tool. It depends on the process. We are a very high mix and low volume factory compared to, the silicon fabs, something like Global Foundry, for example. They might run, the same amount of stuff that all of the DoD microelectronics does might be done by a Global Foundries or a big foundry in a day. So the levels really change as far as what is done.
Right. How many steps are you talking about in the process for fabrication of a wafer in the processes that you're running?
Again, it really depends. It's like making a layer cake, and so it depends on how many layers you're making. It depends on what the substrates are. So as we talked about, the reason that a semiconductor is special is because it has, a certain number of atoms in its outer, valence, right? So it has four electrons, excuse me, in the outer valence, and it allows you to either make it an insulator or make it more conductive, a conductor, and that's the reason it's semiconductor. You can use other things and pair them together to get that same response. Those are called compound materials, and that process can be more complicated, but everything starts out with some kind of substrate. Then basically you're adding or subtracting layers to create little tiny gates or transistors in there. But you also might create much more complex hardware or complex processes. The real focus now is uh, something called 3D heterogeneous integration. And that's basically creating little mini skyscrapers as you think about that way, but at the nano level. Things like through silicon vias or through substrate vias to allow you to connect one chip to another chip, and sometimes changing the recipe of how you do that. And there's pretty complex recipes that are used to create these, um, the various chips and the technology that goes with that.
Indeed. I mean, when I worked, oh gosh, 20 years ago, was working in semiconductor, and I think the number of steps in a routing or recipe was maybe 800 or 900, and now they're up to 2,000 steps, and sometimes it takes months to get through all of that. It's highly complex. So along those lines, then, so you've got long range capacity planning you're looking at. You've got all these different business considerations. What's your job like day to day? What are your challenges day to day to make sure that those things are ongoing, or is there other things that you're dealing with and just coordinating amongst the various teams?
Yeah, so I support a vice president who's in charge of really running the business operations, so the profit and loss for that particular group. But he's supported by other areas, I guess, or disciplines. So financial management, business management, the logistics group, global supply chain, engineering, et cetera. So it kind of takes a village to make it work. And so, part of my job is to coordinate that staff as kind of a chief staff officer. And it's, these are responsible, smart people. So it's not like chasing cats, herding cats. But it is still one of the main challenges is understanding what information is important and bringing that information up, and then also, figuring out what's not important, what doesn't need to be shared, what can be actioned or changed immediately. Because I think all of us are in the situation where we've got more information than we need. May not be the right information, but we have to filter through that. And I think that's, step one is understanding what's important and filtering that non-important stuff out, the noise.
Yeah, that is a constant battle day to day, definitely. So, Trey, looking at semiconductor manufacturing facilities that have evolved over time, brownfield facilities, rather than being built from scratch, greenfield, what kind of operational constraints do you see compared to those two, or either one in particular?
Yeah, sure. So all of our facilities have been around for quite some time. We've been making microelectronics since like the 1950s or maybe earlier than that. And so what you get in the opportunity to build a new building is you can plan all of those utilities ahead of time. It requires a lot of coordination with the county, with the state. We use quite a bit of clean water in our processes. So, that's a clear consideration where you site it, and the support of the kind of general community is really important. We don't just receive, gas or just electrical, and the normal things you might expect would be electrical and maybe water, but we're talking about lots of different materials. The logistics concerns of bringing those in, some of them very hazardous, some of them very dangerous. So, being able to plan that in advance, and we grew up essentially outside of two airport hubs. So one is outside of LA and one is outside of BWI. If you could go back 50 years and plan, somehow else, you might do that. Clearly, greenfield is definitely better from an operational efficiency perspective. But once you already have a plant, you just have to keep adapting that and changing it. You run into challenges like obsolescence. You run into challenges like, you're trying to grow in a certain way and, you can't anymore because the county says you can't grow there, or you have no more parking. So sometimes it constrains your growth in those ways.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, for people who are not familiar with it, when you install semiconductor and all these tools that we've been discussing, there's a lot of exotic gases, for instance, as you mentioned, some of them highly hazardous that support those equipment. And one of the things, particularly people who want to do, the classic lean manufacturing where we just come in and we just move all the equipment around, we establish a flow line. That doesn't work too well in semiconductor. You can't just pick up tools and move them. And it provides its own set of challenges, doesn't it?
Yes, and you mentioned this, but when we're qualifying a tool in a clean room, so you set the clean room up first, then you bring the tools in, but you have to actually, there's a staging process for them to actually get, first of all, that they function according to what the manufacturer's specs were, and then you have to, work on, does that work for your process, your recipe, your whatever it is you're trying to do, so that you can say, yes, this tool will produce the results that I want, and the quality that I'm getting out of the tool is acceptable, the yield. So you might know this, maybe the listeners don't, but on a given wafer, depending on the size, you're going to only receive so many what they call known good product or known good chips, because you may have a problem with something the size of a hair or smaller, interfering with that, or just a problem in the manufacturing of the wafer itself. Even though all of those processes are highly controlled, you can't plan for everything.
No, that's right. That's right. There's a lot of variability, which of course is what operation science is all about. How do you balance capacity and inventory and time in the presence of variability? And semiconductor has very high levels of variability from all sorts of different sources. You mentioned contamination, but just the complexity of the operations. You don't get 100% yield on all your wafers, but that's the way it goes. And one of the things we talk about in operation science is the fact that you have variability means you will have more or less of capacity, inventory, time. Those are your buffers. But if you increase variability, you might have to increase those buffers, which might increase your cost. But guess what? If you get revenue above the required increase in cost, it's still a good deal. So it's understanding what the right combination there is, and it's just particularly complex in semiconductor, and that's just the way the business is.
Right. And sometimes, you can mitigate problems maybe of time if you have a delivery that's needed by adding people, work more shifts or something like that. But if you are already working 3 shifts, or if you are already working, X, Y, or Z, and you have a tool that goes down and you don't have redundancy, which again, as I mentioned, we are a very high mix uh, fab. So we don't necessarily have, 3 of everything or 10 of everything. So sometimes those unique assets go down. They're needed for a particular process. Ordering, as we said, the parts is expensive anyways, or ordering the tools. So swapping out a tool is challenging, but even, flying people in to look at that tool, or even yourself trying to fix it, can be a long and lengthy process.
Indeed, it's just that's the way the world works. That's why we say it's operation science. It's not operations magic. If you have one tool and there's a lot of variability, and you can't make inventory ahead of time, well, then that means all you have left is time, and things take a little bit longer. And so, those are the levers that you have to work with, and I'm sure that you and your team are familiar with those intimately. So when you're trying to plan long term, you mentioned you were coordinating the many different groups. Do you guys have a demand planning meeting that goes on monthly? Is there some people call it the PSYOP process, SNOP planning? Do you do that?
We do have a demand planning meeting, but that's really focused more on, we have facilities demand, and we also have a kind of staffing demand, kind of a monthly meeting. Some of it's, seats available for the growth that's planned. The other part is, what are the current projects that are ongoing? What are the new ones that need to be stood up? Of course, back to the same theme, you know, getting facilities up and running, whether it's building a new clean room or a place where people can sit and do the work they need to do. Um, Often the work is on the classified level, so you know you can't just sit them in any space, and that process to accredit facilities tends to be lengthier than you ever expected, right? That's just the answer. It's going to take a lot more time than you planned.
Yes, yeah, that's the dynamics of it. That's the operation science of it, indeed. So let's talk about something that we have to talk about because it's the newest, hottest topic, which is artificial intelligence. How are you and your organization incorporating artificial intelligence into what you do, or are you doing that? And do you have plans to do so?
There's definitely a drive to try to incorporate AI in different areas. There are some places where I'm going to call it old school AI, which is things like machine learning, and using, instead of just looking at a microscope and looking for defects, you would use, train an algorithm to say, this is known good die for this particular process, or this is, a defect that has this particular, problem. And you can classify those and basically building that classifier, which is, kind of a CNN convolutional neural network, uh, multiple layers to basically be able to tune that algorithm to be able to detect a particular problem or a particular challenge. We've been using that. They use that in the fab. Um, but what are the other tools? What are the other things that are coming online? And how can we use those to move faster is definitely always something we're looking at and considering. We use old school AI, and we also use, try to use some of the flashier, new stuff that's also out there, um, to find ways to leverage that to be able to move quickly.
Is your organization providing training for employees on AI? I know I've talked to other organizations where they say it's mandatory you take 12 hours of training on how to use, for instance, ChatGPT. Is anything like that going on?
I think there's an overall, you know, desire to, first of all, constrain, what the uses are, that how you're using it. So kind of policy came first, and some of that guidance is in place. We don't have as a lengthy of a process to ensure that you're a responsible user, but there is some training to be able to say before you know, can only use these tools, kind of restrictive, but some of that's because there's an AI guidance group that is looking through and saying that has a vulnerability, that one doesn't, this one's good to use, etc.
Yeah, particularly when you're working with the DoD, that's very important, right? Maintaining confidentiality.
And there's differences in what is a deliverable, customer deliverable, to what is something where, hey, you might use it to research a particular area. You're not necessarily turning around and giving that to somebody and saying, "Hey, I did this all by myself. I'm turning my homework." But it might help you to do your job in a more efficient way.
Definitely. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that develops. I know, well, everybody knows that it's going to induce big changes. I personally think that we're kind of at the
Hype cycle.
yeah, compared to the computer revolution, right? I would say that we're kind of at the PC level, where I don't know if you remember, but the PC XT was kind of like the first big personal computer. I think literally we're sort of at that stage, but it's the Wild West right now, indeed. So let's switch a little bit. I know you were in the Navy and worked on aircraft carriers, and we talked a little bit about how those operations go, which is kind of very timely given the conflict that's going on right now in Iran. But let's talk a little bit about your experience. Tell me what you did in the Navy and how you see the parallels between operations, for instance, on an aircraft carrier and operations in semiconductor. Or I'm sure there are plenty of differences too.
Sure. Well, first is I was in the Navy for 25 years. I got to do a bunch of different roles and jobs. My primary role was as a P3 naval flight officer. So for those of your viewers that might have seen Top Gun, they'll know that there's a pilot, that's Maverick, and then there's Goose, who's the weapon systems officer. That was my role, kind of like a quarterback, to be able to decide, what play we're going to do, execute that play, and then, see the results and, kind of continue from that. Our main mission was really anti-submarine warfare. So finding submarines, tracking them, etc. But we did a lot of other different missions. Additionally, I got to test unmanned aircraft systems or drones in the Navy, and I also worked on an aircraft carrier, as you mentioned. That role is called a shooter, a catapult and arresting gear officer, and is the person that is required on deck or in what they call the bubble and used to launch the planes safely and also recover those planes safely. And kind of, when we look at our big system of how to do that, it's a super dangerous place. And we're able to do it safely because high level training and also, designing and engineering a system that will prevent you from making some critical errors, right? You can't error proof everything, but you can prevent certain things from happening and ensure that you get, Six Sigma type performance out of a really dangerous system.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned Six Sigma type performance because, you stimulated this question as I'm listening to it because in commercial aviation, the safety record is incredible, right? I mean, it's like 99.99% successful takeoffs and landings. I guess it's a little bit less with the Navy because it's a lot more dangerous, but still, you have an amazing amount of successful operations going on where you're launching and landing aircraft day in and day out. Talk a little bit about what that operation is like. I mean, how does that get designed? How do you know when you're at capacity or what capacity is? And I'm sure it depends on things like the weather, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that is done is, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. There's a lot of training that goes into it. So, for the training side, everybody's trained on some basic safety principles. You're not allowed on the flight deck unless you know what to do. You're also, required to wear certain equipment to basically keep yourself as safe as can be, right? I say safely because, you can work safely, but it's not a safe environment. Um, so, so for example, everybody wears hearing protection, everybody wears goggles, you use hand signals because you can't hear. So, pulling chocks, turning up your speed or whatever, all of those things are what are done in order to communicate in a really challenging environment. Even passing control of the aircraft, they'll use hand signals to pass that control, and there's positive confirmation of that control as well. Um, so working safely, there's always a brief ahead of time. You always say, here's, for this particular go, which is a launch of maybe, 10, 12 airplanes. Here's what we're going to do. Everybody meets together. They talk about the plan, kind of like, calling a timeout before an NCAA game, right? Or whatever. Here's our pregame plan. You go and execute the plan. You say, how'd we do? If there are any problems, there's a process to kind of iron out those problems. There's a safety reporting, process. So it's fast feedback loops, um, planning in advance, understanding how to communicate with people, and then also just executing that in real time. Being flexible, everybody's highly trained, but they're empowered to make decisions and empowered to, stop. I'm going to say pull the line, the and-on cord kind of. If you see something that's unsafe, we can do what's called a suspend. So instead of launching the aircraft, something's wrong, you stop the process. So we kind of step it up to readiness, and you get to a point where you say, okay, that is, we are ready, we're good to go, we got a green light, deck's clear, no other issues, I'm going to launch, and you launch.
And so, how often does the suspend happen? I mean, is that an occasional thing or rare thing, or?
I'd say it's fairly occasional, but the reality is the steps that have to happen is first, there's a lot of verification processes that go on as just normal operations. So first they'll come up and they'll show a weight board to the pilot. And again, all of this has been briefed ahead of time. They've said, hey, we need for example, 45,000 pounds for an F-18. That's our weight. And they'll hold up a board and they're allowed to change it, twice. And if it's wrong, then the pilot has to actually call up to the tower and get them to change that setting. Because what that does is it changes a valve that opens to basically be able to push the steam, into what's called basically in the catapult, shoots the spears down, and then drags the aircraft off, and launches it into the air. But all of the process to get that set up and verified, happens in a loop of conversation and communications with the pilot, with the deck crew, with um, the handler, who's the guy who basically plans the movement of all these things ahead of time.
Yeah, a lot of coordination. And you mentioned the training. How long does that training last before you're allowed on the deck?
So it depends kind of on the position, and we went to what they called shooter school, and I want to say it was like 2 months maybe, which wasn't a super long time. They do it in Lakehurst, New Jersey, but basically they get you up to speed on all the equipment ahead of time, so that the first time you see an arresting gear wire, you're not like, what's the arresting gear wire? A little bit about teaching you, some of those pieces, but then you also have a process, and this is kind of typical of the Navy. Before you do anything, there's, a qualification standard that you actually have to, get signed off on. So somebody who's experienced would walk you and do something. You'll kind of walk through it, and they'll sign you off to say, okay, you understand the problems, you understand the concerns, you were safe in your operations, I'll sign you off. And that process continues until you are, able to menial tasks, maybe initially, to then recovering airplanes as an arresting gear officer, then to launching on the bow, which is kind of easier, then to launching on the waist, which is the most complex. So there's kind of a process even through that to kind of step you from, like we call it crawl, walk, run, but that training process of learning from others, learning yourself, but kind of incrementally through the whole process. To contrast that, we are still working through kind of how do you train, microelectronics engineers to do the things they have to do. And we're still wanting to improve that process. I don't know that there's the same crawl, walk, run. You still have to get certified by different people to be able to operate certain equipment. But that is one of the things we're trying to improve, that process qualifications.
Right. So that's a crossover between flight operations and semiconductor. Anything else that you see other than training?
So FOD is a real concern. So foreign object damage, which is also the thing that could cause it. So kind of a funny story, I guess, but we had a submariner that landed on the aircraft carrier. He was the first admiral to be what they call a CAR group or carrier group commander. And he landed, and they did, they rolled out the red carpet. They had rainbow, side boys, what they call them, the standing attention, saluting. He walks in, and immediately after this, they called for a fall walk down, and we were like, we were all done. What happened? And come to find out, we were looking for a collar device, which is like a single star, which had fallen from the new admiral submariner's, uniform, and now it was somewhere, who knows, in the airplane or on the flight deck. And, if that get ingested by an engine, potentially that engine could fail. And now you've ruined, multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. So I'd say that's the biggest commonality is, hey, FOD is a big problem. We don't have a clean room on an aircraft carrier. We actually have a dirty shirt, place where the people that are wearing, all the aircraft grease can go and sit and have food. So opposite of a clean room, but that emphasis on, safety, or I guess operations, um, challenges. So instead of wearing, the bunny suit, we would wear, appropriate clothing to protect from, FOD damage. For example, you always check your pockets in a flight suit. You got a zipper, pockets there. You never carry any pens. You don't really carry your loose change up on the flight deck. So you always check yourself to make sure that things are tied in, and then also you have the right equipment to do the job you have to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it, a wrench on the deck is contamination, just like a hair is on, on a wafer, right?
It's just easier to spot, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Easier to spot, a little bit different scale, but the concept is the same. What about when you're working on the flight deck? I mean, are you just so busy that you're just paying attention to get things done? I mean, what are your, I would say, the fondest memories you had from that operation?
The first thing I would say is the emphasis on safety is like paramount. That's the first thing. They tell you, keep your head on a swivel because, there are really, no joke, dangers all around and you can't necessarily hear them because you're wearing hearing protection. So something like a blade, engine blade that is turning, a propeller, it's invisible at night. You can't see it. So you learn certain procedures. For example, they say never walk through a prop arc. So you're just, regardless of whether it's stopped, you don't walk there. There are just keep out zones. And being aware of your surroundings, being aware of others, um, you know, really helps you to, I guess be safe. But, there are times if you didn't have a cup of coffee and you went up on the flight deck and you're launching a EA-6B Prowler, that aircraft puts out a deep resonant, bass that's I don't know what frequency it's at or dB, but it's so loud it just wakes you right up, shakes out all of your internal organs, and you're just like, I can't believe this is a thing, you know. And one story, I guess, operational safety wise, we actually had a guy. They call him a center deck operator. And he sat right between the two catapults, and he had just a little cavity, deck cavity with an open hatch, and a piece of foam he'd sit on there, and they'd have a grease pencil, and they'd have it in their mouth, which I was like, why are they doing that? Well, it's so hot in that area because the exhaust from the basically there's six F-18s that park, and their exhaust flows right into the landing area, and it's about 130 degrees in that location. And these guys, they work incredibly hard in crazy conditions. And I think that's the part that I guess I'm most proud of, to be able to work with teams like that, that are doing working 15-hour days in crazy conditions, and then sometimes doing maintenance after that. So getting 6 hours of sleep or whatever. But everybody works together. You work as a team to you know do the mission, keep each other safe. You train to do all these different emergencies just in case you have to do it because it might save somebody's life.
Right. Yeah, those are high stakes. And so actually that's something we should probably talk about for a minute, and then we'll switch topics. But the whole idea of mission and purpose, that is so important to teams, whether you're in semiconductor manufacturing, hospitals, or on an aircraft carrier flight deck. Are you able to bring that sort of camaraderie and focus to semiconductor manufacturing? What are your observations on that?
We're certainly trying to, right? I think that the reality is that culture is really important. And I'm not sure who it was that said it, but culture eats strategy for breakfast. It might have been Peter Thiel. I'm not sure if that's or Thiel.
I forget. Yeah. Deal or Drucker or somebody.
But I found it to be really true that you have to really work to, build that camaraderie, even if it's not, hey, we're not all on mission out in some foreign land or foreign location doing the mission. The things that we're doing, and we do tie this to mission, the systems that we're making, they go into radars that are going to protect against, potential air threats. And so I think that is definitely something that every, employee knows. But even around that, how do you make those little microcultures of, we do this particular thing, like for example, March Madness, some of the people are in a bracket and, it's just for fun, but, you know, it's something you can do to be with your teammates in a way that's more than just contractual or, obligation, just work stuff.
Yeah, indeed. Those informal contracts are really, really important. I mean, actually, as important or more important than the legal contracts they sign when they come to work. So when you are working with teams, then one of the things we find with operation science, actually, where it's really, really powerful, is people tend to have different mental models. And sometimes those mental models aren't correct. And as I think I demonstrated for you, it's easy to see that, for instance, people have different understandings of the relationship. The classic one is between cycle time and utilization. That also is a big benefit in terms of getting people to have a common understanding, which is why we do the Operation Science podcast, to make people aware of that. But at work, when people have a common framework, and the framework is tied to the performance of the operations that you're managing, and it has correct prediction of behaviors, you really tend to get a lot of good results. But yeah, it's hard to overemphasize the importance of shared mission and purpose and teamwork. All right, let's switch a little bit and let's talk about Treat Dittmar, the man. Where'd you grow up? What was your childhood like? What led you to the Navy and then to semiconductor manufacturing?
Well, so I will say a couple of things. One is I grew up in a military family, and I would say son of a sailor, kind of, but except for my dad was a Marine Corps test pilot, so he flew helicopters in the Marine Corps, and also went to test pilot school, which was kind of a trend because he worked for a company called TRW, which eventually got bought by Northrop Grumman, which was like, well, that's kind of a trend. And he went to the Naval Academy in 1968. My father-in-law also was a 68 grad, so two Naval Academy grads, myself, my son, so kind of this kind of lineage of naval service. If you go far enough back, I've got my grandfather was in World War II in Korea. His dad was a POW, so just lots of heritage there. And so when I thought about what to do, honestly, I wanted to study ocean engineering. And my dad was like, "Hey, you should probably consider going to the Naval Academy." I had a best friend who was applying, and so I was like, "Sure, sounds great." It's not too far away, but on the water. And the reality is, I didn't have any idea what was coming. I wasn't the best plebe ever, but I found out that in life, you know, being the smartest in the room or being the most physically fit isn't always the most important thing. I feel like I have pretty good leadership and teamwork skills, which were important as I continued through the rest of my career, and fairly adaptable and able to learn lots of things. So that's another key trait. Um, I've got a large family. There's operational logistics involved with that. My wife is she's the main operational planner. I just usually fund the operations and then fill in when told to go to a certain location and pick up said child, I try to do that.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So from those experiences, also you spent a fair amount of time abroad in different countries and cultures. Talk a little bit about that and how that's influenced your outlook on how you work with people.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is you learn that your way isn't necessarily the right way, that there are lots of different ways of doing things that are equally valid and maybe better, right? So, for example, there are cultures that are very collaborative and they're not going to be super independent and they might be slow to make a decision, but when they make that decision, everybody's already agreed. That's very different than our culture. But you might say, that has validity because now everybody does get on the same page. I had opportunities to travel to, lots of different countries. I think the opportunity to learn some of that language before you go, learn some of their culture before you go, and not be elitist, like, oh, we know how to do it the right way. Because the reality is, maybe actually Italy knows the right way to do coffee. Like they got it down, they figured that one out. Right. So, I mean, maybe try it, right? So, and different foods, right? So, I never had ceviche until I was somewhere in Spain, and it was like, hey, try this. It's, we didn't cook it, but we cooked it with essentially a lemon. And I'm like, that doesn't sound tasty or good, but you try and you're like, it's pretty good. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I lived and worked in Japan for 2.5 years and have the same outlook. I mean, you learn so much about your culture by living in other cultures. It's kind of interesting by contrast what you pick up. All right. Last question. So from all those experiences, you're talking to somebody who's starting out in their career, maybe they're interested in operations. What advice would you give them?
The biggest thing I would say is that, kind of tying back to that previous discussion we had with what do you learn from other cultures? There was a saying, I was learning Serbo Croatian, right? I got a book that said, every beginning is difficult. Svaki početak je težak. And that's been one of my favorite sayings, because you move from one job to another job, and you're going to start, you're going to start something, and it's going to be hard. Expect it to be hard. Don't expect it to be easy. Expect that you're going to have a learning curve. Expect that you're going to need to reach out to others to learn. So, that should drive us to not isolation and just suffering, but it should drive us to realize that you're in a learning phase. You don't have to have all the answers, but you should try to, improve. And, you don't want to stay at 0. Ideally up towards 11 or something. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's brilliant. Absolutely. I love that expression because I think it keeps a lot of people from trying something different because they think, oh, it's going to be hard. Well, yeah, it's going to be hard. That's the whole point. Yeah.
it's going to be hard, and you can probably learn it. So as an example, every person in China speaks Chinese. Is it a hard language? Not if everybody speaks it, right? I mean, so
Somebody's learned it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, comparatively, maybe for someone who already has a certain framework, it's hard, but everything is learnable and knowable. It depends on the time that you have to invest, and your inclinations, I guess. I think anybody can learn anything, personally.
Yeah. It definitely all depends on attitude. Some people cut themselves off before they start because they just are worried about the difficult part of it. But that's definitely part of the adventure. All right. Well, Tree Dittmar, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's a fascinating conversation. Love the contrast between flight operations and operations management in semiconductor. Appreciate your time and look forward to talking with you in the future.
Thanks, Ed. I really appreciate the discussion as well, and wishing you great success with the rest of your podcast episodes.
Thank you much. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
The Operations Science Podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. Join the Operations Science Institute at opscience.org. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode. The views expressed by our guests are their own and do not represent their company's views unless specifically stated as such.